While they're striking the piano, I've got another royalty story. This goes back a couple of years. Canada House in London was just being unveiled after a very extensive and very expensive renovation. And since City TV had provided most of the audiovisual content for the new Canada House, I was invited to go to London and participate at this opening. We were to be honored by the presence of the Queen. And indeed, she finally arrived. In fact, she stopped to speak to me. Well, I think it was the Queen, because she was wearing this very big hat that covered just about all of her face, and I must confess that I had that thought in the moment that maybe there were 3 or 4 of them all over London at that time, shaking hands with impressionable people from the colonies. There were about 2,000 people in Canada House, and she didn't stop to talk to many of us. She stopped to chat with me for a second, and then she went further into the building and walked by hundreds of eager people, business people, artists, so on, and walked straight over to Paul Gross and said, "Oh, you're the Mountie." Now that's stardom. So Paul Gross is actually the product of, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars of Canadian government expenditure and the finest efforts of our finest moguls, a genuine Canadian television and motion picture matinee idol. Paul Gross.
Do I sit here or
Wherever.
stand?
What?
You know, the amazing thing about the Queen, this is gonna, I don't usually think this way, but why I bring it up is that it completely shocked me, is the size of her breasts. And you don't actually notice that on the money, because they cut her off kind of about here. But I remember thinking, oh my God, what a rack. And that's the only way I can think of her now. And I am a monarchist. I mean, I love them. I think we should keep them as long as we possibly can. And as long as we keep sending them foolish people like, you know, North America sends them Michael Jackson. We got to have the royal family. I'm going to sit down, is that right? Because they're funny. I was in love with Lady Diana when I was in university, and I had plates. And they were very hard to find plates with just Di on them, because I didn't really want him on them. But I had a full set of plates with just her, and I ate off her face every day. And I was living in a house with a bunch of other guys, and I would beat them if they touched those plates. The Queen, I remember once being in I think it was just after the wedding, and I was in a little diner with Jackie Burroughs, and there was this street woman kind of sitting in a booth, howling completely to herself, saying, "The princess, the Queen, the King." And somehow I understood that it's a really weird idea. And then, don't you think? The Queen. And then Nepal comes along, and I think, wow, from the deepest mists of history comes a current legend that just sort of explodes forward. So I don't know if we ever move very far. I'm sorry I'm a little dithery. I don't have any kind of speech. I just came from an editing room where I saw the first assembly of a film I've just finished shooting a couple weeks ago called Men with Brooms. And I've been told by everybody the first assembly you want to shoot yourself, but I don't particularly. I think it's going to be good. But I was struck watching it how, and this is the first time I've ever directed anything. I've had an awful lot to do with various aspects of television and films, acting mostly, and then executive producing and writing. But this is a new thing, this directing thing. And I kind of like it, because you get to be a benevolent dictator. And everybody asks you questions, and you come up with phony answers, and they go away and do what they want to do anyway, and you take all the glory for it. So it's kind of a nice job. But actually, more seriously, I was watching this assembly, which, I don't know, for those of you who don't know, you shoot all of this stuff, and then an editor squirrels away for a couple of weeks and strings everything that you've shot together. So it's very long, and this first assembly is 3 hours, and the film will probably be about 100 minutes. So there's a lot to cut, mostly me. And watching it, I thought, there is this great myth about directing, and that most of the stuff that I've ever been involved in my life is really collaborative in a way that's only now becoming clearer and clearer to me. And you know, we have that, I think there are some directors that are much more specific about what they do. I'm actually just untalented, so I kind of pretend I know what I'm doing. But I think it is quite true that most of what we do is the combination of hundreds of people. And I've heard other people say, well, films get divided into 3 groups. There's the film that you write, the film that you shoot, and the film that you cut. Other people will say that a film is 30% of the film is made by the score. I suppose all of these things are true, but what I have been finding is that every single person contributes something all the time. And the one thing I've been learning is that I have to just continue to embrace everybody's ideas. Now, they aren't always great ideas. A lot of them are really stupid, but I remember one time when I was executive producer of Due South's, the transportation department came to me and said, "What kind of car do you want, Paul?" I said, "Guys, Jesus, we've been doing these cop cars for 80 hours of television, just a nondescript cop car. Go out and come up with one." "All right." And then we got to the set that afternoon, and it was a bright yellow Cadillac convertible. How are the guys supposed to hide in a bright yellow Cadillac? "Well, you said be inventive." Okay. So sometimes it's dumb, but most of the time it's phenomenal what everybody contributes to it. There are a whole bunch of scenes in this film that I wrote with John Krasank. And we thought we were extremely clever. Boy, that's a very smart scene, we'd say to ourselves. Isn't that good writing? Which is one of the great things about writing, is you can always think you're really smart. And I would get on the set, and we have this fantastic cast. There's Leslie Nielsen and Molly Parker and Peter Outerbridge. They're just wonderful people. And almost always they would come up with something better. And I've been trying to think about, well, I was sort of thinking about the myth of direction, really. I think it's about time management now, largely. And it's more like being a really good traffic cop. If let's say we were all going to be working on a film, I couldn't possibly tell each one of you how to do the job that you're supposed to do, but I could say, we all have to be in this parking lot behind the Dairy Queen in Pensacola, Florida at 3 o'clock Thursday. And I don't care how you get there, but you have to be in that parking lot. And that's, I think, all directors do. From what I can see. But it struck me as being interesting, because I used to think, when I was just acting, I thought, ooh, they're the keeper of the key. Ooh, they know everything. And realized, at least in my case, no, I know absolutely nothing, but I'm pretending I know what I know. Anyway, it's been a really fascinating experience. And then, as I was leaving the editing room thinking, this is going to be all right. When I cut out 2 hours of it, it should be just fine. And I ran into somebody on the street outside the building who said, "So, I understand you've made the first commercial film." And I was kind of wondering about what that meant, too. We just have the weirdest film industry in this country, which is not to slag anybody who's made movies, because they're friends of mine and I admire the films enormously. But we've ended up with a film, the product of our film, and I think we ended up with it for a variety of reasons, but largely our movies seem to be auteur-driven, and they were driven towards satisfying festival demands. And I don't know if anyone's been to Cannes here, but Cannes is like another planet. It really has no relationship to anything that I know, and certainly not to any normal movie-going audience. So we've ended up with great filmmakers, but who in any healthy film culture would be slightly marginal. But it's odd that, David Cronenberg and Adam McGowan are sort of our Steven Spielbergs, and which is not, I want to be clear about this, I really like their work. But we seem to have lacked in the center something that is less personally driven. Although that sounds sort of stupid, I don't mean that exactly. But we seem to have ended up with movies that are unique to the very specific interior concerns of the filmmaker. And we've made very few films that are just a little bit more broadly outlooking. Usually comedies, of course, are more outward looking. They're really much harder to do, I think, but they rely upon a kind of broader common appeal in order for jokes to work. And yet at the same time, and while we were making it, it seemed to be very personal to each and every one of us making it. And I was sort of thinking about that in terms of just basic storytelling. And why is it that our stories, at least cinematically, that the stories we tell kind of go down a fairly narrow bandwidth. They're not very broad. I mean, if we think of English cinema, it really does kind of hold both sides of the spectrum, or Australian for that matter, or what used to be great German cinema had actually both sides of the spectrum of auteur to kind of populism, or populist cinema. And it'll be curious to see what happens with this movie. I hope it strikes some kind of chord. Lord knows I've loaded it up with every single Canadian piece of iconography I can think of. There's this scene in there that just made me scream, and it's accidental, but I had a scene where they're coming back from a tournament that they're playing at, and they fail miserably. They're beaten by really old guys. And suddenly they have to stop because the road was full of frogs, like hundreds and hundreds of them. And they get out of this hearse that they're driving in, and they sweep the frogs off the road. But then I saw a magnolia that was full of frogs. And shit, I can't use frogs. Beavers. So there are hundreds of beavers in the road, which are sort of generated. We have a couple of live ones. Now, the thing about beavers, too, I've had very little experience with them. The individual beaver, up until recently. And I was at Science North in Sudbury, and they've got these two beavers there called Copper and Nickel. The Queen! Copper and Nickel, and the guy, I said, well, where do they go to the bathroom? Because it's a fairly small tank they're in. The guy said, well, they can only go in the water. This is untrue. We had these beavers out on the road, and they're fully capable of going to the bathroom on the road. It's just beaver shit everywhere, mounds of it, which we have to now, with computer business, we have to go in and remove all of that. Anyway, they're really weird animals, and at a distance, they look like giant rats. So there are beavers, there's Sudbury. I think we have maple leafs everywhere, Moosehead beer. It's really craven, I guess. But while we were doing this stuff, someone would say, is this too much? I think, I don't know, maybe it is, but as far as I know, no one's ever tried it. I mean, as far as I know, this is the first curling movie. It's a very weird sport. But it's one of the oldest, apparently. 1511, the first known rock, has a date carved in it. So it's a lot older than baseball. And they are amazing, the people who are good at it. I'm not one of them. I think, though, we're going to start a genre, the curling film. There'll be... did you see this picture? Yeah, it was a serial killer picture. Oh, yeah, I just saw this a curling picture. Oh, yeah. But it is curious, don't you think, that we've... You know, you remember this, did you see this in the news about Scott Thompson and the waving a dildo in Ann Michael's face at this? I thought, when I read it, I thought, what a knucklehead. What's he up to? He seems so crazy. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, no, there is something kind of lunatically bold about it. And to attack the intelligentsia seems sort of like attacking the Beaver or the Canadian Shield or Can Lit. You know, you're not supposed to say you people are really stodgy and boring. But there is a kind of clamped, horrid intellectual restriction that this country has. or at least that I have felt over the years artistically. There's that which is legitimate and that which is something else, or not to be considered, or to be kept outside. And in the course of making this movie, I've found that it isn't any different than anything I've ever worked on, whether it's Hamlet at Stratford or a scene with beavers in a road outside of Toronto, or even a crappy movie for Disney set in Aspen. The undertaking is always identical. Some of the techniques might be slightly different, but you're essentially still only trying to tell a story. And in reduction, I think whether it's dance or cinema or theater, or it kind of doesn't matter. In the end, we're all still trying to get to that perfect moment where you're sitting around a campfire and there's black all around you and you're telling a tale. There, I've run out of stuff to say. Thank you.
Like the disciplined artist that he is, he hit his mark exactly.
Really?
At 6:15. Uncanny.
Thank you very
Uncanny.
much.